Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. My name is Sekar Pratiwi and then my friends.
And my name is Dilla Paradilla.
So we are from 11 group want to present about our material in the interpretations and translation class. So in this class we choose the results of our group is discuss about intercultural issues in interpreting language, and I will explain about the contents and so on.
So, for the contents, we will explain about the interpreter part towards intercultural issues. The first is what is culture specific item or GSI, and then culture and intercultural encounters.
And then third is modes of interpreting. And then last but not least is fourth, culture and interpreter rules.
And the first explanation is the interpreter part towards intercultural issues. Interpreting is conceptualized most evidently as mediated interaction between two or more communicating parties with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. For grounding issues of communicative purpose, role, trust, status, and power, viewed from a social rather than a cognitive psychological perspective. The interpreter is seen as a mediator not only between language but also between cultures and value systems. Hence, the role of the interpreter as prescribed in codes of ethics and professional conduct has emerged as a particularly controversial issue, especially in dialogue interpreting within community-based institutions. For culture-specific items or GSI, the first is the potential problem existing in interpreting could be five basic group of prototypes as follow is the first is terminology or nomenclature, and then the second is internationally known items and sets, and then the third is concert object and basic level items, and the fourth is word expressing perception and evaluation often linked to socio-cultural norms, and then the last is culture-bound elements. And then we have five different classes of cultural categories. These are designed from each other. Those categories are as following. The first is ecology, the second is material culture, and then the third is social culture. The fourth is organizations, customs, activists, procedures, and concepts, and then the last is gestures and habits. B. Culture and intercultural encounters. Successful intercultural communication involves language or verbal communication, body gesture, or we can say non-verbal communication, the use of times, space and silence, and so on. Impartiality or mere ethical requirements for interpreters who is not allowed to give their opinions or to alter in any way that what a speaker expresses through their language. Draft in 181 states that mediation between cultures requires the communication of ideas and information from one cultural context to the others. So it is essential to find out the extent to which an interpreter can be mediate rather than merely translate or interpret in order to improve the communication flow. Therefore, these following factors affect communicative even in interpreting. Let's move to the next slide. For the effect of communicative, we have the style of communication. We can say high context and cultures. It attaches great importance to applied meaning and nonverbal communication. In these cultures, the communication style is indirect and relies heavily on the listener's intuition and the cooperation. In Platt 2002 states that the interaction happening in high context culture are mostly implicit, like guided, circular, and indirect. Rather than by the actual utterance, the meaning is carried by the body language, the settings, the relationship between the people involved. Next is low context cultures. The English language appears as a very effective communication tool for low context cultures, since it reflects a belief in objective reality and is structured in such a way as to clearly identify agent and action. In addition, English is known for the vast size of its vocabulary, and words with slightly different meaning enable the language to be used in very flexible way to express fine variation or shade of tone with a great precision and without the need to paraphrase too often. English speakers like messages that are direct, explicit, rational, concise, and informationally dense. Therefore, they might find it difficult to interact with a speaker using long, complex sentences, and in some cases, even regard such a communication style as reflecting a lack of commitment and interest on the part of their interlocutor. Okay, for its mixture of low and high context characteristic, Italy is generally placed midway between the high and low ends of context spectrum, with southerners closer to high context and then northerners. By tradition, Italians consider their language as an instrument of eloquence and use long, complex sentences to achieve greater expressiveness when conveying their ideas. To an Italian, therefore, the direct approach of a low-context speaker may easily sound overfrank, blunt, and even rude also when this is not intended. And when translating from English into Italian, for example, like the interpreter may need to transform the generic title Mr. or Mirs into one of the more one specific professional titles in Gegner. Dottore or avvocato, depending on the exact status of the person. Geert Hofstede in 2001 states that in some cultures and subcultures, being polite to the other person is more important than supplying correct information. The consequence of this on the interpreter's work is that sometimes the filters imposed by politeness may make the message quite ambiguous to an outsider and therefore require a high degree of mediation. For the high and low contact cultures of countries, we have a chart. It's, let's say, a simple chart of the other country that have a low contact cultures and then have a high contact cultures. For the low contact cultures, we have let's say Swiss Germans, and then Germany, Scandinavian, and North American. We think is North American is coming to low contact cultures, and then in the middle we have French and English. And I think North American is coming up to in the middle, but in the low context cultures sometimes. And then for high contact cultures, we have, of course, Italian. We have to explain before. Italian is have a high contact cultures because his language is really different and have a high contact cultures. And then we have a Latin America, and then of course Arabic, and the last for the highness is we have Japanese countries. So that's all about the countries who have a low contact cultures and high contact cultures. And then the most low is Swiss German, and for the high one is Japanese. The second is the concept of time, and the concept of time is including into planning, scheduling, punctuality, and deadlines are concerned. Tensions might arise quite easily and included to the tasks of the interpreter or cultural mediator. On the basis of his or her intercultural competence, to make sure such a different attitudes do not become the source of major misunderstandings by briefing the participant beforehand, whenever possible, or by interpreting in a more diplomatic way, so as to soften the atmosphere and allow the negotiation to proceed. And then for cultures that view time as flexible, it's mean like the country we can say it in South Europe, Mediterranean countries, and like the Latin of America. And for cultures that view time as valuable, it's mean like we can say the United States of America, Germany, England, Canada, and something like the Europe place in Europe.
Alright, I will continue to explain about the next material that is about. Third is turn-taking and the use of silence, where misinterpretation of a different style of discussion, especially in a business encounter, may lead to a negative outcome or the results of the meeting. So silence may receive as an answer to an offer may be perceived by a Westerner as confusion, or as a negative response, or even as anger at the speaker or the proposal. And the rush to fill the silence or insistence on getting a prompt answer may prove irritating and offensive to an individual belonging to a more listening culture. Moreover, Westerners often or tend to interpret moment of silence as a failure in communication, but in other cultures like Oriental cultures, it is a sign of respect to take some time to process the information without talking oneself. So it's kind of a brainstorming or thinking process for them. For example, in other cultures like the Anglo-Saxons, when A stops, then B will start, which means it is not polite to interrupt. And in the more verbal Latins, instead, do so quite often, where B will frequently interrupt A and vice versa. So, to show how interested she or he is in what the other is saying or gonna talking about. Finally, in the Oriental style of communication, when A stops, a pause follows, and only after that will B start. Next, C. Modes of interpreting. First, simultaneous interpreting. Poheka 1982 states that in simultaneous interpreting, the extent and visibility of cultural mediation is often extremely limited. It is also important to note that the lapse of time occurring between the original utterance and the translation is too short to allow any major rephrasing or cultural mediation on the part of the interpreter. And Guile 2001 emphasizes the time pressure to which simultaneous interpreting is the subject. Second, consecutive interpreting. The lapse between the original speech and the translation gives the interpreter time for rephrasing, summarizing, or when and where possible, and bringing in any cultural references that should, in his or her opinion, seem necessary to better convey the intended message. Third, liaison interpreting, which when consecutive interpreting is performed in less formal context, normally without a rigid distinction between the audience or mainly listeners and speakers. It is normally called dialogue, community, or licensed interpreting. Where denomination liaison interpreting is better to convey the idea of interpreting as a link or a connection between people, and liaison interpreting is characterized by a dialogical communication mode and can take place in a variety of settings, from business premises to hospitals, police offices, the factory floor, and virtually any other places. And interpreting provided in favor of immigrants in doctor-patient encounters or in the courtroom implies a wide gap in status between the two interlocutors, which means culture being the real gap between the parties. Especially, or for example, in business meetings, the two parties usually hold similar positions and have a shared educational and professional background. And liaison interpreting in business context is one of the settings in which the interpreter's cultural mediation can be most important to the two parties. Next, D. Culture and interpreter roles. First, interpreter as message converter. Firstly, all professional interpreters are required to adhere to a code ethics established by the regional, national, or international organization to which they belong, where interpreters must demonstrate accuracy and completeness by acting to, first, convey verbal and non-verbal messages and speaker's tone of voice without changing the meaning of the message. Secondly, clarify the meaning of non-verbal expressions and gestures that have a specific or unique meaning within the cultural context of the speaker. Then maintain the tone and the message of the speaker even when including rudeness and obscenities, where different cultural understandings and levels of acceptance exist for the usage of obscene expressions and profanities, and the resistance that most interpreters have towards uttering such expressions. Although interpreters need to honor the ethical principle of accuracy and completeness by striving to render equivalent expressions, then reveal and correct interpreting errors as soon as recognized. Then clarify meaning and verify understanding, particularly when there are differences in accent, dialect, register, and culture. Next, maintain the same level of formal or informal language register used by the speaker or to request permission to adjust at this level in order to facilitate understanding when necessary to prevent a like potential communication breakdown. Finally, notify the parties of any medical terms, vocabulary, words, or other expression which may not have an equivalent either in the English or target languages, thus allowing speakers to give a simplified explanation of the terms or to assist speakers in doing so. The second point is the interpreter needs to consider the explicit and implicit information, where in low context cultures, a large proportion of the message is encoded explicitly in the words and structures, whereas in high context cultures, a smaller proportion is verbally encoded with a greater proportion of the meaning needing to be inferred from the context. For example, in court context, it is unacceptable for interpreters to change implicit language into a more explicit language or version. For as Badenzio explains, it will obviously be a challenge to the court if interpreters were blah 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 allowed to clarify an erroneous, deliberately ambiguous question. Badenzio, 1988-75. However, in many contexts, this issue can give rise to genuine interpreting dilemmas. Suppose a Western company makes a proposal to a Chinese company and receives the response, "Haolu, haolu." This literally means I or we, which means implied will, which means implied think it over. But in this context, it is generally understood as signifying polite refusal. Kondo et al., 1987. How should this be interpreted? Rendering it as "will think it over" could give the wrong impression and lead the Western representative to expect a response later. On the other hand, saying "I am afraid we cannot agree at this time" might be a specific, especially if the Chinese company wanted to be deliberately ambiguous. Clearly, the interpreter's decisions on such matters can have a major impact on the interaction. 2. Interpreter as message clarifier, where an interpreter may need to intervene during an interpreting session in order to clarify a message. This can arise in the following ways. First, the interpreter has not fully understood the concept she or he is being asked to interpret and needs to ask for clarification. 2. The interpreter realizes that the client or practitioner has misunderstood or failed to understand the message, even though the interpreter was correct. Third, the interpreter needs to alert one of the principal interlocutors that a misinference has occurred or that a different inference has been drawn. For example, first, different meaning inferred, where a health visitor in attempting to determine a date of birth may ask to see a passport, yet such a request to some clients could imply that their status was being questioned. So an interpreter may intervene by explaining to the client why the request is being made and suggesting that any form containing a date of birth will do. This can then be reported back to the health visitor. Second, inferred but not stated and knowledge assumed, where a GP may offer a hospital referral to a patient for minor surgery, and the patient may be resistant as they are not sure if they can afford to pay for this yet may not say so from embarrassment. The GP may have assumed that the patient is aware such treatment is free, and an interpreter could prompt this by stating there may be confusion over the issue and asking for clarification. 3. Interpreter as cultural clarifier or informant or mediator, which sometimes the interpreter may need to explain what lies behind the behavior of one of the primary interlocutors, as the following two examples from the healthcare sector illustrate. First, Chinese birth traditions, where a Chinese mother who has recently given birth may be resistant to coming into an appointment until a month after childbirth, due to a traditional cultural practice of the mother and baby remaining in the home for this period. Second, a Spanish-English interpreter who is called to the well baby nursery, where the interpreting for the physician who asks a woman whether she wants her baby boy circumcised, she nods, but then pauses and very seriously adds, "But my friend had a baby circumcised here, and they did it too much. I don't like how he looks. Can they just cut off a little bit?" To me, the woman clearly wants to decline the procedure but is having difficulty refusing what she considers as instruction from the physician. In general, Latinos feel they should agree with physicians out of politeness and respect, even when they really disagree or do not understand the issue involved. They expect physicians to make the decision for them and do not understand why they are asked to make choices. They are used to and seem to prefer deferring to experts. These patients do not understand the American medical system and its notion of informed consent. Only when more acculturated do they start taking the level of responsibility for their own health that Americans routinely assume. Language and cultural issues once again are intermixed. Moreover, Hefner 1992 stated that the latter example illustrates how interpreters may feel the need not only act as cultural clarifiers but also as cultural informants. Fourth, interpreter as client advocate. Crawford 1990 reports that the Aboriginal language interpretation programs in Canada vary in their official commitment to interpreters acting as advocates. However, he maintains that the interpreters in his study frequently work informally as mediators, using their power as gatekeepers over the exact content of the message conveyed, and that sometimes they adopted a clear advocacy role. For example, he reports that many health professionals show discomfort with the extended process of family decision making and that Aboriginal patients typically prefer understanding to offer only a limited range of palliative care options. In these situations, the interpreters step into an advocacy role, telling patients that they had the right to make informed choices about the type of care they wanted to receive and explaining that they could refuse or delay treatment. The interpreter's involvement in mediation under this condition was regulated, however, by their own professional code of ethics, which demanded objectivity and neutrality in the translation of messages.
Alright, I think that's all from us. Thank you so much for your attention and hopefully this video will be really useful to all of you. And we are so sorry if you made mistakes and to juga we beg for forgiveness. Thank you for watching. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.